If you wanted to come up with a list of the most important philosophy books ever written, you would need to start with Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic is widely regarded as his masterpiece. Now, historically, that has not always been the case. There have been some periods of history where the Timaeus or the Laws was more widely available or widely read, but modern scholars and commentators, and just generally people who read a lot of philosophy, regard the Republic as his crowning achievement. Like many of Plato's works, this dialogue centers around Socrates having a conversation, and it begins with a discussion on the nature of justice. The Republic then unfolds to discuss a wide variety of topics, all of which could be said to be about the just governing of a city, or perhaps giving a vision of a philosophical utopia. But as we see at the very beginning of the Republic, it's not just about a city. Justice is about defining the whole conduct of life. It's why Socrates takes it so seriously. In the Republic, we get Plato's taxonomy of 5 forms of government. Those are timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, aristocracy, and tyranny. You also see many of Plato's anti-democratic themes being elaborated upon, because he sees democracy as leading to a kind of mob rule. This isn't perhaps that surprising when you consider that his mentor, Socrates, was sentenced to death by a democratic institution. The Republic touches on many other things though, universals and love and the nature of aging, and it also features a really famous philosophical thought experiment or illustration, the allegory of the cave. And if we think that a work of philosophy is important because it has had a wide impact on the world of ideas, well, then basically no other book, especially in Western philosophy, could be said to be as important as the Republic. That's both in philosophy, but also in political theory. It's why I've been dedicating a read-along over on my newsletter. This is totally free, by the way. I've just been doing a book-by-book read-along of the Republic. You could join and go back and read those posts for free if you'd like. Now, I wanted to make a list of the best and most important and most influential works of philosophy. And after the Republic, I already started to struggle. Then I found this book by James Garvey, The 20 Greatest Philosophy Books. And in this, Garvey tries to do something very ambitious. He tries to give a list and a defense of the 20 greatest philosophy books. And we are going to talk about this book and this list in the rest of this video, because this book annoyed me. This book made me a little bit angry. I disagree with many of the choices in this book, and we're going to go through what I think is wrong with it, and we're going to fix his list so that by the end, we are going to have a list of what I think are the greatest and most important philosophy books ever written. The second work of philosophy that Garvey's book features is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, Aristotle, aside from Plato, might be the most important Western philosopher to have ever lived. He is arguably as influential, and if he's not as influential as Plato, then he's pretty close. And viewers of this channel might know that I love the Nicomachean Ethics. I think it is a terrific book, but I already started to find problems with Garvey's list when he said that the Nicomachean Ethics is the book from Aristotle that we should feature. You see, we have quite a bit of writing from Aristotle. Some of it is clearly not that important, aside from a matter of historical curiosity. That would include a lot of Aristotle's scientific writings. They might be interesting to read, but they're not the sorts of works of philosophy we would return to, and they haven't proven to be as influential as other parts of his corpus. But we have a couple of different books by Aristotle that I think could compete for the most important thing that Aristotle ever wrote. The Nicomachean Ethics would be one. This is where Aristotle gives his theory of virtue ethics, is basically this whole theory of what it means to live a good and flourishing life. Now, I actually, by the way, did a whole video trying to explain that book in outlines, about 30 minutes long. I'll link that down below. And this is also maybe my favorite work of philosophy. It's the work of philosophy that I've read the most, but I'm trying to be objective here. I'm not just trying to pick the books that I think are my personal favorites or the ones that have impacted my own thinking the most. I'm thinking about the books that have had the biggest impact throughout history. And I think that you probably need to say that instead of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, it's Aristotle's Metaphysics that need to make it to the list. In terms of insight and originality, maybe Aristotle's Metaphysics and his Ethics are equal, but in terms of influence, the Metaphysics wins. The distinction between 4 types of causation, material causation, efficient causation, formal causation, and final causation, that alone shaped how many philosophers would think about causation and just metaphysics in general for over 1,000 years. Aristotle's Metaphysics also had a much bigger impact in the metaphysical and theological writings in multiple different religious traditions. We'll see one key figure in that a little bit later when we talk about Thomas Aquinas. Now, I'm not saying that Aristotle's ethics isn't important, and that's actually kind of the weird thing about making a list like this. Because just because a book doesn't make the list doesn't mean it wasn't historically important. We're just trying to talk about the most important books that have ever been written. That list is necessarily quite selective, and if we're only going to put one book per writer here, which feels like a decent rule to have, then we're going to have to go with Aristotle's Metaphysics. If you took a look at Garvey's book, you would notice something very strange happen when we got to book number 3. And that's because his third pick is from Thomas Aquinas, who we will talk about. But there is about a 1,300-year gap between Aristotle and Aquinas. And I think that Garvey is leaving out some very important works of philosophy. He's also ignoring all philosophy that wasn't written in the West. So let's try to correct that to make this list a little bit better. If we want to have a broader perspective, then we need to include at least 2 works of Chinese philosophy. That would be Confucius' Analects and Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. The Analects are also called the Sayings of Confucius. They are essentially the central text of Confucianism. And Confucianism straddles a line between philosophy and religion and an ethics of life, but also a way of governing a nation. But I think that shouldn't count against it as an influential philosophy, because you could say the same thing about Plato's work, that it straddles that same kind of line. And I think you could make the argument that Confucianism is just as influential as Platonism or Aristotelianism. It was just influential in different parts of the world. Now, there are similarities between what Confucius taught and what Aristotle taught, particularly about virtue. Confucianism does place a really large emphasis on the cultivation of virtue. So this especially comes out in the central concept of Ren. However, I think Confucian ethics is distinct from Aristotle, and I don't think that we should try to understand Chinese philosophy primarily by first comparing it to Greek philosophy. So we're going to add Confucius to our list, and I also said that we need to add the Tao Te Ching, which is the foundational text of Taoism. Now, this book actually is traditionally called just the Lao Tzu, after its author. Now, Lao Tzu as a historical figure has actually been contested by some scholars. Some people say that he's a purely legendary figure. We're not going to focus on that, and we will just talk as if it's Lao Tzu writing this book, and we'll continue to call it the Tao Te Ching, which is sort of an honorific given to this book to indicate its canonical status in Chinese literature. Like Confucianism, Taoism can straddle that line between philosophy, religion, and also governance, because in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu is discussing everything. And like Plato's thought, it's quite systematic. It's linking the individual ethical life and the art of governing and also metaphysics all together to come up with this comprehensive picture of the entire world. I say that it's systematic just to mean that it's producing a system of understanding and interpreting the world. Taoism and Confucianism, along with Buddhism, are usually held up to be these 3 great schools of Chinese philosophy. And so because we have the Analects there, we probably also want to add the Tao Te Ching. Now, are we going to add some kind of Buddhist philosophy here? Well, I'm not adding one onto this list for now, and I could see that some people might disagree with me and want to argue with me down in the comments. I welcome the discussion. And I'm not adding it for the same reason that I didn't add something like the Upanishads here to represent Indian philosophy. I'm trying to identify those key central, singular books that shape a whole tradition. And as I was digging in to see about both in Indian philosophy and in Buddhism, if there were those one singular text, kind of like Plato's Republic or the Analects of Confucius, I wasn't finding them. I think you could make arguments for a few different texts here, but I didn't find them, and I decided to play it on the safe side and omit those. But if you think that this list could be improved by some additions, then you should let me know down below. So we've added 4 books to our list so far, and I think before we get to Thomas Aquinas, Garvey's third pick, we need to talk about one more work of philosophy that, especially when you're considering just Western philosophy, has to be included. Or at least one philosopher, and we'll talk about which book we should add after we talk about him. That's Augustine of Hippo. Augustine sort of marks this transition from ancient philosophy to early medieval philosophy, and he certainly represents a synthesis of Platonism and Christianity. Well, and if you're just thinking about the impact of ideas throughout history, this synthesis of Platonism and Christianity is massively influential in Western thought. I debated which work of Augustine should be included in this video, and it came down to the Confessions and City of God. And I ultimately said the Confessions, but I don't feel totally sure about my choice here. The Confessions is this kind of strange work. It's part autobiography, it's like a memoir, it's part prayer or meditation, it's part scriptural exegesis. There's a lot that's just about the first chapter of Genesis. But if you've read the Confessions, you also know that later on in the book, there's a huge philosophical discussion about the nature of time and a lot of the sort of background technical details you would need to make sense of a kind of Neoplatonist form of Christianity. Now, Neoplatonism had been thriving at the time around Augustine. There are plenty of Neoplatonist thinkers in the century before him. These would be both pagan Neoplatonists like Plotinus, but also Jewish Neoplatonists like Philo of Alexandria. There were other Christian Neoplatonists like Origen of Alexandria. And eventually, down a little bit later in history, you would see Neoplatonism exert its influence on Islam. So synthesizing Neoplatonism with religion was a monumental task. Augustine wasn't the first one to do it, but once he did it, he sort of established a paradigm for especially Western philosophy and theology for quite a while. And so for that reason, we're going to include the Confessions on this list. We tend to think of this time between ancient Greece and essentially modern philosophy starting in about the 17th century as this just intellectual dark age. And I'm hoping to correct this slightly by at least having Augustine on the list and flagging other thinkers like Plotinus or Philo of Alexandria or some Islamic thinkers that'll come up later, at least flagging them as potentially important and worthy of our consideration still. As we go further into the medieval world, though, we can finally get to Garvey's third pick, which is Thomas Aquinas. And the book here is the Summa Theologica. This work is essentially Aquinas's comprehensive summary of Christian theology. It's a summary of theology. And Aquinas is drawing from a wide variety of influences. You could not call Aquinas parochial in who he's willing to cite and the philosophical resources he's willing to draw upon. You know, Ibn Sina, John the Damascene, Maimonides. He's willing to look anywhere he can for truth. It's quite admirable. But there are some figures who exert a much bigger influence on the Summa, and throughout the book, Aquinas actually refers to them by title rather than name. Those would be the Apostle Paul. He simply calls him the Apostle. Aristotle is simply called the philosopher, and the Islamic philosopher Averroes is called the commentator because of his many and thorough and widely distributed commentaries on Aristotle's philosophy. In fact, I believe that the commentaries from Averroes would actually be distributed with Aristotle after both had been translated into Latin. This was how Aristotle was transmitted, at least in parts of the West. Philosophically, if you are encountering Aquinas now, it is probably because of something known as the 5 ways, which are 5 arguments for the existence of God. This is where you'll find quite a bit of philosophical discussion. Interestingly, it represents just a simple fragment of the entire Summa. I believe that the Summa has over 3,000 articles in it, and the 5 ways are just one article within the Summa. Nevertheless, that book is hugely influential. Thomism as a school of Catholic theology and philosophy. It's also a way of adapting Aristotle and continuing that through medieval philosophy. And so I think Garvey is right here to include Thomas Aquinas on a list like this. But now we get to my biggest complaint with this book. The thing that actually made me angry when I started to read it, which is that this book dedicates the vast majority of its focus to modern philosophy. So starting in 1641 with the publication of Descartes' Meditations, and then the final publication, the publication of the last volume of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 1885, that's about 250 years, and 12 of the 20 books that Garvey mentions were published in that 250-year period. So we are covering 2,500 years of philosophical history in a book like this, but more than 50% of the works discussed were published in a 250-year period. That seems overly restrictive, and that should set off some red flags that immediately this book is overlooking some things. There is no Neoplatonism, for instance. We tried to fix that a little bit by talking about Augustine, but we could have also talked about Plotinus. There is no Boethius as well. There are no Islamic philosophers, and it seems like by the standards that we're employing for the rest of this, including something like the incoherence of the philosophers or the incoherence of the incoherence, should at least get an honorable mention in a video here. So let's officially do that. We're going to probably put the incoherence of the incoherence in a list like this. Just overall, it's a limited view of philosophy, and I think that we can do better by the end. So here are all of the works of modern philosophy that Garvey mentions that he thinks deserve to be in the top 20 books of philosophy ever written. René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Berkeley's A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Rousseau's The Social Contract, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, Marx's Communist Manifesto, Mill's Utilitarianism, and Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There are too many books here, I think, to go through all of them in turn, but here's what I would keep. I would keep Descartes' Meditations. I would say that this is a great example of early continental rationalism. This is a distinctive form of modern philosophy that still marks a turning away from scholastic metaphysics, but it's heavily invested in the capacities of our minds to produce knowledge, and in Descartes' terminology, to produce, knowledge that we can be certain of. And also, Descartes' method of radical doubt is certainly influential. I think you see its impact, and Descartes' conclusions, in particular about mind-body dualism, they had their historical impacts. So we're going to keep Descartes. I would also say that we can keep Hobbes' Leviathan. There have not been a ton of works of political philosophy on this list. The Leviathan, as emblematic of a kind of social contract theory, I think is totally worth having, and I don't think that a list like this should have both Hobbes and Rousseau, so we're just going to have Hobbes. We will keep Hume's Inquiry as emblematic of British empiricism, and really, as Hume is the ultimate sort of empiricist who's willing to go where his skepticism will actually take him. Hume is one of my favorite philosophers. I remember reading a poll of academic philosophers, especially in the English-speaking world, to name their favorite philosophers, and I believe Hume won by a mile. If I can find that poll, I'll link it down below. I mean, it's just interesting to see, and I think those philosophers are generally onto something. Hume is a genius, and Humean empiricism and his sort of anti-metaphysics certainly had its impact, especially as we go into the 20th century. We get into things like logical positivism. You could read those as essentially continuing the Humean program. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is the text of German idealism. Kant's influence on German philosophy, and probably philosophy in general, is very difficult to overstate. The Critique of Pure Reason represents Kant entering into what is called his critical period. This is where he's putting away the pre-critical writings. Actually, reading Hume was part of his move from the pre-critical writings to the critical writings. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is just an easy pick here, so I'm not going to contest that very much. Then Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I think where Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is sort of the initiation of German idealism, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is its fulfillment. And I wouldn't contest including Hegel in a list like this. I would also keep Mill's Utilitarianism, both for its impact on philosophy and ethical philosophy. The dominance of utilitarianism and consequentialism, especially in the Anglo world, was pretty huge. It also had real effects on the world in terms of policy and education and things like this. So Mill's utilitarianism is good. You could have made a case for Mill's On Liberty instead, but the utilitarianism pick is fine. Then to that list, I think we need to add Spinoza's Ethics. This is the best instance of the geometric method, this attempt to prove a whole philosophical system from simple definitions, from true propositions and then basic definitions of terms. It is a masterwork of philosophy, and it was also seen early on as important enough and dangerous enough that Spinoza was censured by multiple religious communities, governments. They saw Spinoza as a deeply dangerous thinker, which I think also usually means he's probably onto something. And then there are two books that Garvey included that I think we would just need to change. The authors deserve to be there, but we need to change which books. So let's talk about the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto is not a good work of philosophy. The Communist Manifesto is hardly a work of philosophy at all. It is a work of political sloganeering. It is a work of propaganda in the true sense. It is Marx and Engels writing on behalf of an organization trying to announce their political program. and to inspire workers, and ending with a slogan of "Workers of the world unite." It is actually a compelling piece of rhetoric, but it is not a great work of philosophy. However, Marx, in terms of influence, would have to be in a list like this. The profound impact that Marx had on the world with his writing, like Kant, almost is difficult to overstate. I would say if you've written books that have led to multiple revolutions and world wars, global wars, that could create the defining great power struggle of the late 20th century, Marx plays a role in all of that, but also in the world of ideas, you feel Marx in literary theory, in economics to some extent still, sociology, anthropology, basically all of the social sciences, any academic field that is called like theory, anything theory, there is some kind of Marxist influence. Marxist thought just is everywhere. And Marx was fairly prolific as a writer, but the work that's sort of his monumental work, the work that really defines his intellectual output, would be the first volume of Capital. And so instead of the Manifesto, we should have Marx's Capital here. And that brings us to Nietzsche. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is an iconic work by Nietzsche. I'm just saying that I am unsure if it's the right work to include. I tend to think that Beyond Good and Evil or The Genealogy of Morals would be better picks, but I feel like I'm being really critical of Garvey's book, so let's keep Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and we'll just put an asterisk next to the name, just to say, sure, it would be one book that from Nietzsche you could pick, but other options would also work. Actually, my personal favorite Nietzsche is The Gay Science, but I don't think that would qualify as the most influential, important work by Nietzsche. It's just the one that I happen to enjoy reading the most. This brings us to our final discussion here, the 20th century. I think we're going to have too many books from the 20th century, and probably we just have to admit that this is our own bias as people who just came out of the 20th century. We're going to overemphasize things. There's recency bias always in a list like this. I've tried to correct that a little bit by trimming up Garvey's list, but I'm still going to have some of that recency bias. Now, Garvey includes 5 books from the 20th century, and they were actually all written in a 20-year period in the 20th century. Those would be Karl Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery, A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, Sartre's Being and Nothingness, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, and then Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Now, I'm going to throw out a lot of those, but let's first ask, what are we leaving out in a list like that? Well, notably, there are no early analytic logicians who made logical positivism, like A.J. Ayer's work, or logical empiricism, like Popper's work, possible. For instance, there's no mention of Gottlob Frege. And I think Frege's work in mathematical logic, the philosophy of language, and the philosophy of mathematics, they are the great underpinnings of analytic philosophy. So that's a notable omission on Garvey's part. There's also no Husserl. Now, early Husserl and Frege are more similar than you would actually initially suspect. But later on, Husserl goes on to be the sort of establishing figure of phenomenology. And there is a work of phenomenology on this list, Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Like, I find that one baffling, especially because Being and Nothingness is widely regarded as an important work. It's not nothing. It's not bad. None of the books that we've discussed so far are bad. It's widely regarded as being fairly derivative of Heidegger's Being in Time. And so first change I think I would say to make to Garvey's suggestions are that instead of having Being and Nothingness here, we're gonna remove that and we're gonna add Being in Time by Heidegger. That gives us a nice representation of both phenomenology and existential. Being in Time is also a masterpiece. Heideggerian phenomenology, like all of the books that have made this list, Heideggerian phenomenology has been very influential. Early Heidegger is more influential, I think, than late Heidegger. Late Heidegger is notoriously incomprehensible. So including an earlier work like Being in Time seems most appropriate. So instead of Karl Popper or A.J. Ayer, we're going to have Gottlob Frege's The Foundations of Arithmetic, because I think it's a more important work of early analytic philosophy, and that sort of mathematical philosophy that we saw in the German and English-speaking worlds. And instead of Being in Nothingness, we have Heidegger's Being in Time. Now, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, I think that's a good book to have on a list like this because of her influence on feminist philosophy and the way that feminist thinking came to be taken up in multiple domains. So the Second Sex, I think, is a good pick, and Garvey was right to have this. And I think he's also right to end the book on Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The investigations mark a turning away from that kind of mathematical conception of language that Wittgenstein had actually been a proponent of in his earlier work, the Tractatus. And it's a repudiation of many of his younger thoughts. It introduces the concept of a language game. It also poses the problem of the indefinability of certain concepts like game. Famous illustrations throughout the book, like the duck rabbit. This book got taken up by tons of people in different areas of academia, but also in philosophy. It was also, in case you care at all, it was one of those first works of philosophy that I really pored over. I think at this point, I don't have my original copy of the Philosophical Investigations anymore because it literally fell apart. The spine completely disintegrated because I read it and marked it up. It was one of those first works of philosophy that I fell in love with, and I really cut my teeth trying to understand it. So this has been a little rambly, so let me give you the list that we are left with. We end with Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Metaphysics, the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, Augustine's Confessions, Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the Incoherence of the Incoherence, Descartes' Meditations, Hobbes' Leviathan, Hume's Inquiry, Spinoza's Ethics, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Mill's Utilitarianism, Marx's Capital, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but there's an asterisk there. It could have been Beyond Good and Evil or The Genealogy of Morals, Gottlob Frege's Foundations of Arithmetic, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, Heidegger's Being and Time, and Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. So that is my attempt to give a list of the 20 most important works of philosophy ever written. I'm sure there are people with very strong feelings, and I look forward to hearing all about it down below. Now, also down below, you can find links to any of the books that I mentioned in case you want to buy them. I have links especially to recommended editions and translations because one of the common questions that I always receive is what translation should I buy when I mention a work of philosophy? I answer that just by linking to the books directly down below. I'm going to encourage you though to buy physical copies and to not buy ebooks. I have recently taken a really strong stand against buying ebooks or digital content in general because of all of the problems that come with our rights of ownership. That's actually the topic of my next video. It's all about digital ownership. I started getting worried about the ebook market, but that led me eventually to start looking at broader issues just about digital ownership in general, the way that our rights of ownership are being eroded, and what we could do about it. And if you want to watch that video right now, you can go and watch it over on Nebula. Nebula is an independent creator-owned streaming service and has some of your favorite thoughtful creators. My favorite sorts of videos are usually explanations on topics that I didn't even know could be interesting, and you can find all sorts of videos like that over on Nebula. So when I'm watching videos by Adam Neely or Religion for Breakfast or JJ McCullough, I'm always getting that feeling. It's why I like watching content on Nebula so much. Now, I put all of my videos up first on Nebula. I am always a video ahead. And at this point, I actually watch content more often on Nebula than I do on YouTube, just because it's got the content that I want, a nice curated collection, and it's presented to me with this clean and simple UI that I actually enjoy using. And if I'm looking for longer entertainment, there are Nebula originals, like this new show that we have on Nebula, Abolish Everything. This is a comedy show that's dedicated to exactly what it says in the title, abolishing everything. If you want to hear arguments for why we should get rid of jazz or Cybertrucks or loud noises, that's the show for you. Unlike other streaming platforms, Nebula actually invests back in creators. It lets us take bigger risks and do bigger and more ambitious projects, and that creates content that you also get to watch. If you want to watch any of that content, you just need to use my link, which is go.nebula.tv/Jared Henderson. You'll receive 40% off an annual subscription. That's only $36 for the year. You'll be supporting Nebula, but you'll also be supporting my channel. And for that, I say thank you.